Well, the Prime Minister there. Current time in the Middle East coming up on 12:30 a.m. Saturday morning. Very fluid situation. Hundreds of trucks filled with humanitarian aid lined up, ready to cross into Gaza to help more than 2 million civilians. We just got clarification from a guest we had on earlier here on Power Play. He originally told us during the interview he believed the first truck had now crossed into Gaza. He then contacted us just after the interview to say, in fact, the truck has not crossed over. We do know the war in Israel is having a big impact here in Canada, too. We've seen protests, marches, and rallies across Canada. Now close to 3 dozen MPs, Liberals, New Democrats, Green Party calling for a ceasefire. Politically, it does put pressure on the Prime Minister if members of his own party are breaking ranks, calling for a ceasefire, which, of course, is not official Canadian policy. Let's bring in our front bench, Sabrina Grover. She was a federal Liberal candidate in the 2021 election. She's now a principal at Shakti Strategies. Former Conservative Industry Minister James Moore. He's a senior business advisor nowadays with Dentons. Good to see him. Guratan Singh, former Ontario NDP MPP, now Vice President of Crestview Strategy. He's also the brother of federal NDP leader Jagmeet Singh. And our very own Rachel Aiello, senior digital parliamentary reporter here at CTV News. Good to see all of you. Thanks for taking the time. Let me start with you, Mr. Moore, if I can. This letter from MPs, Liberal, NDP, and Green Party, asking for an immediate ceasefire. Your thoughts?
Meaningless, other than to sort of reflect back to constituencies within their individual ridings that they care about a peaceful outcome, which everybody, I think, ultimately wants is compassionate and decent human beings. We want that to be the outcome. But this is about feeling self-important and reflecting that back to people whose votes you want to get. But it, of course, will have no actual meaning or consequence in the real world.
Sabrina, your read.
So the fact that it's I disagree with James on the fact that it's something where they are trying to feel self-important. I think really what this letter is about is it reflects for many of those MPs and for their constituents the fact that this isn't a black and white conflict and that the conflict didn't start 2 weeks ago. For some of these people, they may have very deep-rooted histories. They may have families in the region. And so I think it's more about reflecting that history and the complexity of this conflict. And I think, listen, it's within the right of these MPs to be calling for a ceasefire. That's not Canada's official policy. It's not necessarily for Canada to adopt, but it's well within their right to be able to call for that.
Guratan, your read.
It looks like that when we look at this letter and all the different parties coming together, they've effectively been echoing what the NDP has been calling for. And it seems that we're seeing across the board now people asking and recognizing that while Israel has unequivocally a right to defend itself, it's important that we still abide by international law. And it's important that ultimately in all conflicts, it's innocents who bear the brunt of all these kinds of wars and attacks and pain. It is important that we ensure that there's a preservation of human life on all sides and across all bodies.
Rachel, it's interesting, too, when you think about who the Liberals were on this list. That does include a former cabinet minister, Omar Al-Gabra, also 2 parliamentary secretaries, including Adam Van Koeverden. The pressure this puts on the Liberal government, on the Prime Minister, to see members of his own caucus, breaking with what is currently, anyway, government policy.
Yeah, I think it just adds to the level of pressure the Prime Minister is facing right now. He is both facing calls from now MPs and then Jewish organizations to clarify his earlier comments about whom he felt was culpable for the Gaza hospital bombing. The Prime Minister also has not come out to say whether he feels that any actor in this war is infringing international humanitarian law. What the Prime Minister has said so far is they are working with allies and other officials to try to get to the bottom of what went down in Gaza this week before commenting and saying that, they believe that international humanitarian aid needs to get through, but will not say if international humanitarian law is being breached in prohibiting that. So he is walking, Todd, a very thin tightrope. And now as more pressure is coming onto him, 23 Liberal MPs have signed this letter. It's going to increase the pressure for him to come forward with a more substantial response and a more clear stance of where he is right now than we've seen so far.
James, Rachel's talking about the Prime Minister walking a tightrope. What do you make of how he's handled this over the last, what is now 2 weeks?
Well, he was silent for too long in the beginning, and then they very quickly condemned Israel for an attack that they didn't commit against a hospital, apparently, based on State Department evidence that's come out now. But let's go back to this letter. Let's be clear. Imagine if the third and fourth place parties in the Argentinian parliament came out and wrote a letter. Do you think that that would have any impact on the Middle East and what actions are taking place there? The demand for a ceasefire is a demand for Israel not to push back against people who are attacking them. That's what it is. Do you think Hamas is going to read a letter from a backbench NDP member of parliament and really care? Let's be honest about Canada's place in the world, the voice that we do have, and let's use it effectively. Calling for a ceasefire now, after Israel has had the worst attack committed against its people in generations, and people have been slaughtered in a genocidal attack, and people who are wanting to eradicate Israel from the map, after they've been attacked, a ceasefire demanding Israel not push back and defend itself is only allowing Hezbollah to reload and attack again sometime soon. If you want peace, peace is not compatible with a terrorist organization that wants to eradicate Jews from the planet Earth. That is not a reasonable or serious response to serious times in the world.
Back to Sabrina in Calgary. Sabrina, your response?
I think that recognizing that this is one of the worst humanitarian situations in a wartime situation we have seen in decades, possibly ever, and the pending humanitarian crisis that is about to occur in Gaza as electricity continues to be off, as water continues to be limited, as humanitarian aid isn't able to get in. I think there's a larger very complex situation in recognizing the lives that are at stake. And you can certainly respect Israel's right to defend itself while also respecting the multitude of lives that are going to be at stake if this humanitarian situation continues down the path that it has. And regardless of whether or not these MPs have called for a ceasefire, that isn't Canada's official policy. And as I mentioned, it is well within their right to have that position based on the fact that this is a complex issue. It is an issue that has been active for over half a century. And these people have ties to that region that are well beyond anyone on this, anyone who's just kind of casually talking about this.
Back to you, Garatin, and James Moore at the beginning saying this is basically useless. Your read on whether the letter is in fact irrelevant?
I don't think it's ever irrelevant when elected officials come forth and express a sentiment that is usually echoed by segments of their electorate. I think it's their democratic duty, frankly, to ensure that those voices are being heard. And we're seeing a degree of unity across the board on a message to ensure effectively that across the board, we're seeing a minimization of the loss of innocent life, and I think that's a step that MPs are within the right to do.
So what happens now, Rachel Aiello, on this? Do you think this will be the beginning of more MPs coming out? There were no Conservatives, we should point out, who signed it, and no one from the Bloc either, as far as we know.
Yeah, and the Conservatives, Todd, earlier this week during a Take Note debate, Michael Chong made a point of saying that Canada should resist the temptation to call for a ceasefire until Israel's stated goal of demolishing Hamas was achieved. So we'll watch and see. I wouldn't expect to see Conservatives calling for a ceasefire anytime soon. But I think where this goes from here, Todd, is what happens with the Canadians that are in Gaza. We heard from Global Affairs Canada earlier today that there's around 430 Canadians that have registered for assistance there who have been unable to get humanitarian aid and so far have been unable to get out. Government's also watching potential spillover into Lebanon, preparing for potential air evacuations, as we've seen in Israel, heading to Lebanon for the over 14,000 Canadians that are there. So, while this domestic conversation is going on, as people have rightly pointed out, this is an extremely emotional conversation. Every riding in this country has communities that are being impacted by this. There is also the immediacy, the hands-on approach the government has to have in assisting the Canadians that are in the Middle East right now.
Well said.